bear with me. All right, tonight's webinar is being presented by myself, Anthony Smith, the Chair of Airworthiness, and I've got Drew McKinney, the Safety Manager for Gliding Australia, along for the ride tonight. I was expecting a little bit more of a turnout, but we'll work with what we've got. Tonight we are talking about a recent incident which could have had pretty severe outcomes. This was a propeller which departed an aeroplane during a post-maintenance engine run. This event happened on the 14th of February this year. This webinar will go into the aircraft incident investigation report and cover most of the detail in there. That report is available on the Gliding Australia website under the Airworthiness tab. It's not the purpose of that report or this webinar to apportion blame or liability. The whole idea of this is to prevent future accidents and incidents of a similar nature by talking about what went wrong, how it went wrong, and what we can do in the future to prevent further reoccurrence. You'll notice the report on the website is redacted. I will not reveal the identity of those involved. I will not reveal the type of glider involved, nor the location. So I'm not going to blame, shame or defame. It is really important to the SOAR and the defect reporting system that members can be expected to be treated with confidentiality and a no-blame culture. I would much rather hear about people's embarrassing little accidents and incidents than have it swept under the carpet and buried and not learned from in the future. So with that in mind, I know many of the people attending tonight will know the identity of those involved. Please do not reveal their names either verbally or in chat or by any other means during this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and I will have no hesitation in kicking people out if I start seeing some misbehaviour in revealing who, what, where, when. So I received a fair number of emails, actually, quite a lot of interest from the gliding community when the report was released on the Gliding Australia website. Quite a few horror stories from the past emerged, similar kinds of things or related incidents, which may not have been reported or dealt with appropriately. However, I did have one person tell me that they weren't going to attend tonight because they were only interested in pure sailplanes, and that this was a prop story. This is not the story about a propeller coming off a sailplane with potentially fatal consequences. This is actually a story about a missing bolt. And so we're going to be talking about how this bolt was got left out of the equation, how it got missed. So and this can be made parallel to just about any other place on the aeroplane where a bolt might be fitted. So we'll talk about what happened, we'll talk about the sequence of events, we'll go into the famous James Reason model and the Swiss cheese slices. We'll have quite a chat about human factors because there are, without a doubt, a lot of human factors going into this story. And we will have some questions later on. If you have any questions during the conversation, please use the chat or stick your hand up using the webinar controls. So the basic story. During a post-maintenance engine run, the propeller assembly on a self-launching sailplane, what we call a pop-up toaster with a propeller that folds up from the arm fuselage, separated from the pylon at approximately 4,500 RPM, so more or less full power. The propeller travelled forward under its own thrust and then dropped down and struck the upper fuselage about 2/3 of the distance forwards between the pylon and the rear edge of the cockpit. The propeller then travelled forward and bounced to the left and struck the person who was operating the engine from outside the cockpit. The propeller then continued a further 30 metres. This is a fairly high energy event, narrowly missing the safety observer, and eventually stopped after colliding with parked trailers. And the engine operator required 15 staples to the back of the engine. So this is a recreation of where the engine operator was positioned, and this has been done after the incident. The aircraft has been moved into a workshop. You can see the propeller strike on the upper fuselage, approximately 2/3 of the way forwards from the pylon. You can see the edge of the pylon visible at the bottom right of the photo. So the longer sequence of events, not much I can do about the hum at the moment. On the microphone, guys, just in the chat. The propeller had damage from the propeller yoke, which is used to fold the prop during retraction. This is a sailplane where, when the propeller is retracted, the upper blade is folded down over the lower blade, and it has a horseshoe-shaped kind of structure on top of the pylon, which rotates over the prop to fold the propeller blade down. That is the propeller yoke. As a result of this damage to the propeller, the sailplane was being operated as a purely unpowered sailplane. The engine bay was taped closed, and a minor defect entered in the maintenance release, as per the useful service and maintenance chapter. The propeller and pulley assembly, including the spindle, I'll use the word hub because that's what's in the main spindle, which is really the stub axle that the whole pulley propeller assembly spins around, was removed by the owner and assistant. That whole assembly was shipped as one unit by the sailplane owner to Europe for overhaul and repair. In that same time frame, the sailplane owner identified that there were other problems with the pylon system. Now, this sailplane owner is not the original owner of the sailplane. The current owner purchased the sailplane and it was in a bit of a state, to put it mildly. There's a few things that are not quite right with this engine and propeller system, to put it mildly. So the sailplane owner was doing a lot of investigation off their own bat and identified there were missing parts, and the gas strut, which is used to hold that propeller yoke, which folds the propeller down during retraction, was under strength. So in August last year, propeller assembly returns from Europe, and it was asked to be refitted during the annual inspection. Now, there was a date to make that ready by. However, during the annual inspection, there was a whole lot more bits and pieces found that was not right with the pylon system. These were ordered from Europe. Now, the propeller pulley and assembly was fitted back to the pylon, but again, because the pylon was still not right, it was decided that the aircraft was going to be returned as a pure sailplane, unpowered, with the engine bay taped closed again. So there was not an independent inspection carried out at that time of fitting the propeller assembly. So in February, pylon parts arrived. There's a noticeable delay in time here. We've got Christmas in the way. If anyone's tried to organise shipping from anywhere in the world at the moment, you'll all know there's a significant delay in shipping the parts. So there's a significant delay in bits arriving. So the sailplane gets returned to the hangar to have these replacement parts installed and the engine and pylon system made serviceable. Again, a date was set for delivery. The propeller and pulley and the hub assembly was removed New parts were fitted and everything was refitted. Independent inspections were carried out. And on Friday the 11th, there was the first attempt at an engine run, but the engine failed to start. On Monday the 14th, there was some minor engine maintenance was carried out, and a second attempt at the engine run. The engine was started, and when the engine was ramped up to 4,500 RPM, the incident occurred. The root cause of the problem was the M10 mounting bolt that secures the prop and the pulley assembly to the spindle or the hubs, stub axle that everything spins around on, was not fitted. The thrust from the prop was sufficient to pull the prop and pulley off the spindle. So we'll move into the James Reason model, aka the Swiss cheese model. Pretty well known. This one's a slightly modified model from the original James Reason model. So we have a range of hazards or things that could go wrong on the left, and we have a number of barriers in place to try and prevent those hazards from becoming a reality. And these are normally grouped into engineering controls, administrative controls, behavioural controls, and more recently people have now included an extra slice of cheese after an incident has occurred, which is called a mitigating barrier, or trying to make the consequences of something going wrong less severe. So some examples of engineering controls would be safer design. In this case, we have a single M10 bolt with a single M10 nylock holding the propeller on. It's a single point of failure, not necessarily a great design. Other engineering controls would be a way of isolating hazardous energy, in this case, spinning blades of death, from people around. So a protective screen or something like that. We have administrative controls. So these are procedures, manuals, maintenance procedures, and also included in that is some management of change procedures. So when problems get found during the life of the aeroplane, those problems get researched and the maintenance manuals and the procedures involved get updated. It's an important part of the administrative controls, closing some of those holes in the Swiss cheese, which is why I really like having and try and promote a really good source system and a really good defect reporting system, so we can start closing some of these gaps in the Swiss cheese. We also have behavioural controls, things including PPE, using the correct tools, a personal commitment to following the right procedures. The really common one within gliding is anyone has the ability to call stop, stop, stop if they think there's something going wrong. It's a behavioural control to try and prevent an accident. And in the last part, we've got the mitigating barriers. These are the safety protocols and an emergency response plan. If you get someone hurt, you want to have someone there to give them first aid, call an ambulance. You don't want them unconscious and bleeding out on the concrete. So rather than going through all of these descriptions, what I'll use is the steps in the sequence of events as the individual slices of cheese, rather than these particular groups of slices as shown here. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the human factors. If you've got a pen and paper, it would be a really good idea to start making your own notes about some of the behavioural and human factors kinds of things that have occurred along the way, because there are lots. So, as I said before, I'm going to be using a slightly different version of the Swiss cheese model. I'll talk about each step along the way where doing something different could have changed the outcome. So, we'll talk about the prop removal and the influence the maintenance manuals had on that step in the procedure. We'll talk about the prop overhaul, and then the first prop installation and the second prop installation. So Swiss cheese slice number 1, the propeller removal. Rachel, you've got a question.
Just like,
Can we get a copy of that Swiss cheese sent around to everybody, please?
The James Reason model?
Yep.
Okay. Yes, that
That's a
can be
nice
done.
update on the traditional one.
Yep, sure. That's Amylus, isn't it?
It is.
Okay. Not a problem. It's too easy.
Thank you.
And Amylus, you can take your hand down now too. So the propeller was removed by people who did not have appropriate airworthiness ratings. So that's a pretty clear breach of MOSP 3 section 10 right from the go. The people who removed the prop were following the maintenance manual, mostly. Some steps at the end were missed. There's poor use of the word hub in the maintenance manual, which caused confusion over what was to be removed and not removed. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. The M10 bolt is fitted from left to right in the photo through the centre hole. It does not attach, the M10 bolt does not attach to the pylon. There's quite a large diameter hole in the pylon for that bolt head to sit in. And it retains the prop and the pulley assembly to this stub axle or spindle arrangement with the 4 M8 bolts on the flange. So it goes through the open hole in the centre of that photo. So that M10 bolt was bagged and tagged and put into a particular plastic lunchbox which contained all of the bits and pieces that were being removed from the aeroplane. Emma, so you asking another question, or have you just got your hand up still from last time?
No, still from last time.
Okay. So, we do have a breach in behavioural controls right from the word go, unauthorised people doing the work. And one of the things about having authorised people doing work on aeroplanes is a risk mitigation factor. People have an idea of what they're doing. Moving on to the maintenance manual, because this is in conjunction with this whole step. The maintenance manual was probably translated from German to English, and you get some interesting translations when that happens. The maintenance manual uses the words prop, propeller, pulley and hub. So from right to left on the photo, you've got the white blades for the propeller, you've got the pulley for the belts, and then you've got the hub. And what they're referring to in the maintenance manual as the hub is this stub axle or spindle which everything spins around on. Now the propeller manufacturer specifically stated that they wanted the prop, hub and pulley to be together for overhaul. What they were referring to was the propeller and the folding assembly that the blades mount onto and the pulley to be together when it is sent for overhaul. So you have this confusion created by the use of the different meanings of the word hub between the two requests. The maintenance manual says this is a hub. The propeller manufacturer was talking about the folding mechanism and the blade attachment structure that's on the other side of the pulley. They didn't want the pulley separated. You can see the 4 mounting bolts there. That would then detach the folding mechanism of the propeller blades. So the maintenance manuals were poorly worded and there was confusion between what the propeller manufacturer wanted and what was stated in the manuals. So the people removing the prop did not separate the stub axle, the spindle, from the pulley. If it had been, which is what is stated in the maintenance manual, to pull this apart from the pulley, if it had been, then the whole accident is unlikely to have occurred. Simply because it would have been obvious then that there was something required to hold all that structure together. the behavioural control here is being empowered to ask for help or assistance. These people thought they knew what they were doing. They may have been simply doing it under the radar and didn't want to ask for help because it would have said, well, why are you doing this when you're not rated to do this? Sort of feedback would have been a bit negative. But if in doubt, ask. Anyway, the propeller with the spindle, but without the bolt that's held it all together, was sent to the propeller manufacturer as shown in that photo. So cheese slice number 2, the propeller overhaul. The propeller and pulley with this spindle, stub axle, was sent as one item without the mounting bolt. This was overhauled and repaired at the propeller manufacturer, and it was returned without the M10 mounting bolt being fitted. But it did come with an EASA Form 1 certificate, that effectively a maintenance release that was signed off as being served. This Form 1 created the assumption that the entire assembly, as it was presented, returned to Australia, was complete, serviceable and able to be installed as one item. There would have been a lot of people caught out by this. You get the propeller out of the box and it's pretty obvious that you go and put it on by installing those 4 M8 bolts into the spindle and doing up 4 M8 nylocks on the back or lock nuts on the rear. You would have had to have read the maintenance manual, and this is one of those maintenance manuals that says here's how to remove the prop, and the installation is the reverse of the removal, which I didn't quote. So you would have had to have read the maintenance manual to then realise that there was an M10 bolt missing from this assembly. We have contacted the propeller manufacturer. They have a copy of the report in its unredacted form. We are waiting for a response from the propeller manufacturer about this. We're very keen to talk to them further about whether or not an M10 bolt really should have been installed at the factory. Cheese slice number 3, the first propeller installation. Now, the person installing the propeller is different to the person who was taking it off. There was some communication between these people that did clearly state that the M10 mounting bolt was in this plastic lunchbox. The maintenance venue had that lunchbox and the M10 mounting bolt. The M10 mounting bolt is clearly referenced in the maintenance manual. However, there were more problems found with the pylon system. So there was a decision to go and simply put the prop back onto the pylon for weight and balance reasons. That way, the aircraft could be used as a pure sailplane without the engine. And again, it was just put in place. Pretty obvious installation. Insert the 4 M8 bolts, put on the nuts, and Bob is your uncle. Now, the people involved with this process were appropriately rated. Not necessarily completely familiar with this particular system, but had worked on this particular sailplane previously. When I last looked, and this was a couple of years ago, there were 124 different sailplane types on the register. It's probably closer to 130 now, with a few more arrivals. Probably pushing around 128. There is no way that I would expect a single person to be completely knowledgeable on every single detail of every single sailplane currently on the register in this country. However, there's a chain of email messages that shows that the people who were involved were informed of this M10 bolt. They had it in their possession along with other assorted parts. But somewhere along the way, this information got lost, forgotten, omitted, and it may very well have been, we're just going to throw the prop on, and we'll fix it when all the pylon parts arrive back in the country. So the stage is now set. We've got the prop on the aircraft and the M10 mounting bolt is still not fitted. After 4 months, that's a pretty significant time delay, these new parts arrived. The propeller prop, everything's pulled off again to fit these pylon bits, and now there's a third person involved who has not played this was not involved in either of the first 2 steps. The propeller and pulley and spindle was reinstalled back on the aeroplane, but it was done the same way as the first time, effectively copying the installation as it was done last time, largely copying the same mistake. There was probably no reference to the manuals. I'm told at the time that for this installation, the maintenance people did not have access to the aircraft maintenance manual. They did the first time. There was an independent check on the refitting of the propeller, but it failed to identify that the M10 mounting bolt was missing. So most likely this independent check was looking for what was done as opposed to looking for what was not done. There wasn't a leftover parts check carried out. At this stage, from what we can work out, the M10 bolt was with the aircraft paperwork, which was separate to the workshop. Having this second person copying the same sort of installation as the first time around is a pretty common mistake. It doesn't bite you the first time, it's probably going to bite you the second or third time. People may remember British Airways Flight 5390, where the captain's cockpit window was blown out and the captain was mostly sucked out of the cockpit. Fortunately, retained by his feet tangling up in the control yoke. He was eventually recovered into the cockpit and the aircraft landed safely and everyone survived. The mistake was made by the technician who did the windscreen change previously, installing the smaller than required screws that had been put in last time, despite the fact there are a number of opportunities there to identify that they were the wrong size screws. The screws were still just large enough for the threads to engage on the nuts, but they were pretty much tip to tip of the threads engaging. Similar to the BA Flight 5390, there was no reference to the manuals. The information from the owner was effectively misplaced, not referenced. The parts that were provided with the owner were set aside, and they'd been sitting around the workshop for 4 months. So, just keeping track of questions and answers here. That it had been sitting around for 4 months, so it's probably been put in a safe place where it's not going to get lost. I'm pretty sure there's quite a few people here who identify that sometimes you can put it in too safe a place where it does get put out of the way. Certainly the office ladies do have to replace maintenance releases that were supplied as Form 2 kits from time to time, where the Form 2 kit is put in a safe place and the new maintenance release has been safely put aside in some distant corner and never found again. So the cheese slice number 5, mitigation. The engine operator was running the engine outside the aircraft. Now, there was absolutely no protection to anyone who was outside the aircraft. Some protection would have been afforded by people being inside the cockpit. Now, up until recently, there was a CAR that said it was actually an illegal act to run the aircraft engine without having someone inside in the command seat. Now, with that being cancelled and Part 103 in force, it is now actually legal for people to operate the engine from outside the aircraft. This is intended to enable people to hand crank engines to start them and things like that. What you have to do is ensure that the aircraft is appropriately secured so you don't have a runaway aeroplane problem. The safety person was present. Now, in this case, unfortunately, the safety person did completely the right thing. Unfortunately, the safety person was in a position where they were in the line of fire when this propeller came flying off the aeroplane. So one of the outcomes is going to be that us in GFA land are going to have to review our information that's in the BSE and other manuals about advice on where to be standing and where are the danger zones when doing these engine runs. And as I mentioned before, safety persons are a great idea. If an engine operator had been incapacitated and say lost a limb and was unconscious on the ground, there's a pretty good chance of dying from the injury or the blood loss unless emergency services are called and first aid is applied. No point in having everyone sitting around the clubhouse going, well, yeah, old Bob's taking his time with the engine run, isn't he? I wonder if he needs a hand or not. Meanwhile, he's unconscious on the ground bleeding to death. So we really need to improve our advice on where a safety person should be standing. The other facet is the safety person ready to act? Plenty of stories kicking around from back in my defence days, and at least one anecdotal story where being a safety person is 99.9% boring. And that's a pretty good way to be. And people are in the habit of grabbing anybody to be the safety person. Except on this occasion, something went horribly wrong. The safety person was had a front row view of everything going wrong and curled up into a ball in shock and was bawling their eyes out. And unfortunately, didn't do anything to help the poor person who was incapacitated on the ground. So again, we need to have a look at our advice, but on safety person and briefing a safety person. But the safety person has the expectation that something will go wrong and will react appropriately. And as I alluded to in the last airworthiness webinar that I ran, there are higher risks for activities immediately after maintenance. So after Form 2s, after engine maintenance, there is a much higher risk of things not being connected properly, instruments not being connected properly, things not working as intended. These activities are your highest chance of finding out that something was not done properly. And these higher risks deserve better attention to detail and greater mitigations. So some of the lessons that can be learned here. Human factors. Human capabilities and limitations can significantly impact airworthiness. Well, they can impact a lot of things. So some of the human factors that we've talked about so far. Misinterpretation. Unqualified people doing the work and misunderstanding the intent of the maintenance manual. I can be very critical of many of the maintenance manuals for sailplanes. They lack a lot of details. But as one person has pointed out to me, these manuals are written with the intent of being a guide for experienced people who are qualified to do the job. So they don't necessarily need to spell it out step by step so that anyone can do the job. Now that's a discussion point. At what level do you expect to see the maintenance manuals written? Now, Michael Scudder's got me a couple of questions on the Q&A panel, and I'll get to you later, Michael. The maintenance manual could have used better terminology. There are some question marks there, and the people who were involved did not seek clarification. That would have been a good risk mitigation on misinterpretation. If in doubt, ask someone. EASA Form 1 certificate calls an assumption that for the entire assembly, that the entire assembly is serviceable as presented. And that's a discussion we're going to have with the propeller manufacturer. That misinterpretation would have caught a lot of people out. The parts control. As I alluded to, that M10 mounting bolt was with the maintainers. Somewhere along the line, it got disconnected from things and put somewhere, and it wasn't reconnected later on. To answer Michael's question on the Q&A, the bolt doesn't necessarily need to be replaced with a new one unless it's specified as a life item in the manual. My interpretation of the maintenance manuals is you do not need to replace the M10 bolt. Some rough calculations on the back of the envelope by myself suggest that the loads on the bolt are so low that it will have an infinite fatigue life. You should always replace the nut. I'm a bit dubious about the using a nylock nut to retain a rotating object, particularly when it gets stored in a warmed or potentially hot engine bay, because you're relying on the nylon ring in the nylock to retain the friction, and if it gets warm and gets soft, you lose a lot of that retaining power. So I would always replace the M10 nut with a new nut. In this instance, the direction of the rotation of the propeller is anti-clockwise when looking at the propeller from behind. So you can see why the propeller bounced to the left when viewed from behind, because the downwards blade was swinging across to the right when it hit the top of the fuselage. It would have pushed the propeller off to the left. The reason why it rotates in that direction is it would be trying to tighten the nut up, not loosen the nut. I think it's a mitigation against this single nut with a nylock holding a propeller on. I would much rather prefer probably a castellated nut with a split pin or something like that, something fairly solid and mechanical, rather than just relying on a nylock with a nylon ring providing friction. But yes, I would be putting new nuts on every single time. Getting back onto human factors, delays. Delays allowed details to be forgotten. We had different people at different times working on the aeroplane. So what was done before? Where were the parts stored? How was that information stored, and how was it communicated to each of these people along the way? Somewhere along the way, these details got forgotten. The information that was provided got waylaid, and obviously we didn't join the dots. Time pressure, that's very common. Happens in everyday life. I had it extensively in my professional career. Everyone will have probably experienced it at some time, and at every single airworthiness course we talk about time pressures and pushing back against people who want something now or want something immediately, putting the load on, encouraging people to work faster, potentially missing critical steps, taking shortcuts, bypassing procedures. Another big airline fatality that people remember way back, American Airlines Flight 191, it was a DC-10 in May 1979, where the number one engine, the left-hand engine, fell off. And that was due to the maintenance staff taking shortcuts in the engine change procedures. They were trying to save time and money and effort by using a forklift in the engine change procedures. And that ended up stressing particular components to the point where they developed cracks in the engine part of the company. The crash was actually caused by a hydraulics failure, but when you have the entire hydraulic pump and hydraulic fluid pumped overboard, it's only a matter of time before something awful happens to the airplane. So, assumptions. The part installation looks obvious. No need to check the maintenance manual. Sailplanes, particularly self-launching sailplanes with that look like a Swiss Army pocket knife and that everything folds in and out, are getting incredibly complicated. What looks obvious is not necessarily obvious. People pulling this prop out of the box would have seen the 4M8 stud sticking out of the stub axle and going, yep, pretty obvious how this goes on. And there's no perceived need to check the maintenance. The other assumption, of course, was copying the installation of the prop from the first time. The second person had come along, pulled the prop off. It may have been put on using shortcuts because it was only a temporary installation there for weight and balance, and they copied how they pulled it off. Again, it was an assumption. Referring back to the maintenance manual would have been a big help in this instance. Confirmation bias. Seeing what you expect or want to see rather than what's really there. A lot of discussion in the investigation report on, are you looking for what was done, or are you checking for what wasn't done and checking for what is missing, or are you doing both? What are you exactly looking for, and how are you looking for it? I think would be a better way of answering that question. So we'll talk a little bit about independent inspections. This slide comes from the FAA. It is used in the current slide pack for the airworthiness refresher courses. And it talks a bit about independent inspections, or rather having a second person check these critical steps, critical functions, as they're done in maintenance. So checking for correct assembly and function, control interference, are all the fasteners in safety, are there foreign objects. The one step that doesn't necessarily put back in the checking for correct assembly is, has anything been left out? Would be is an additional step as opposed from is everything done up properly as it was installed? What's been left out? What isn't there? One of the stories that's come out of this, and there's another little investigation going on behind the scenes as to how this aircraft got into this state in the first place, was there were components on the pylon that were missing. And there are literally open bolt holes where stuff was supposed to be secured, but just wasn't there. And why this didn't raise some questions when it should have raised questions of, why do we have vacant bolt holes? What's supposed to be there? So, are all fasteners in safety? Are there R-clips, split pins, lock wires, lock nuts done up appropriately? Do you have sufficient thread protruding from the end of the nut, so you've got full engagement of the thread? Are there any foreign objects? Do you have missing nuts, washers, the odd tools, bits of clippings of lock wire, clippings from the end of split pins, pen lids, 5-cent coins, although they're pretty rare these days, everyone's swiping the plastic. Not uncommon for all those sorts of odds and ends to escape into different corners of the aeroplane. More common these days is little adapters so that you can plug your phone into a 5-volt socket somewhere or something like that. Checking for maintenance-induced damage. Pretty common in the big aircraft world is, before you close out, making sure that you haven't dinged anything as you're doing up your passes and things like that. A story from my past, we had a P3 Orion that was located elsewhere in the world that suffered a fairly significant and spectacular event, and in looking at the damage and trying to recover the aircraft home, we saw that there was some interesting dings and dents around the place where there shouldn't have been dings and dents. After we safely got the aircraft back, we realised that one of those serious dings and dents had occurred much earlier in the lifetime of the aeroplane and had been done during maintenance. Not been reported. So, Not uncommon if you've got a pair of side cutters in your hand and snipping away excesses of wires or cable ties or things like that to nick something unintentionally. Has anything else been damaged while you've been working? Once that second check, that independent inspection has been carried out, the area should be closed up immediately. You'd be amazed at how much odds and ends and other stuff that can end up in a place that's been inspected if it's left open. You can get quite a bit of fodder and other loose ends occurring in an area once you've checked it. Close it up, seal it up, done. And last check, is the work completed in accordance with the documentation, or the, what we always refer to as the improved data? And strictly speaking, you should be signing things up to say that you've done this in accordance with the maintenance manual. You should be doing it in accordance with the guidance of BSE. In this case, it was signed up as being good to go, but that reference back to the maintenance manual. And the aircraft isn't technically airworthy until the logbook entry is completed. So you put the entry into the logbook, it's signed, the second person signs it up, and you're right to go. And this leads into having access to the applicable data during the check procedure. If you're an annual inspector or doing an independent check on someone's work, if in both cases, even if before when you're doing work, if you do not have access to the maintenance manual, you should quite feel free to refuse to do the job. Because at the end of the day, you'll be signing up that you've done this in accordance with the applicable data. If you don't have it, how can you check to say that you've signed up to that state? The person doing the inspection needs to have an idea of what they're doing, what they should be looking at. They need to have access to the maintenance manual or the approved data, the approved instruction. And in this case, if you're doing a repair, you should be looking at the repair instruction. Explain what was worked on, what needs to be in safety, give them a full briefing, etc., etc., etc. The checker must go in with the idea that there is something wrong with the aeroplane and they need to find it. Trusting Bill Bloggs because he's a good bloke and always does good work and you just need to have a quick squiz with a torch and not even bother with the mirror is a pretty bad assumption. Checking all the hidden areas, places where you can't see, using a mirror and appropriate illumination and a torch. Beer penalties, says James. Yes, beer penalties indeed. Using a boroscope if you need to get into some of those hidden corners. If any stage that the check procedure is not passed, say if you find something wrong, person A needs to go back in and rectify the fault, then you start again. Pretty much the same as your checks when you're going flying, pretty much as when you're doing a DI. If you get interrupted or distracted, go back to the beginning, make sure you don't miss any steps. Despite the advice of explaining what the checker needs to do, do not lead the person who's doing the independent check. They need to be independent and do their own thing. And of course, the obvious one, do not interrupt or distract the second checker. If you are doing independent checks, leave your mobile phone in the car or the clubhouse. The last thing you want to do is have the phone go off or the message to come in and you distract yourself with trying to look at the Instagram post or the messages it just or even answering the phone call. Went to a briefing by CASA for maintenance people and they said the #1 distraction causing maintenance problems out in general aviation land is of course the mobile phone. People getting phone calls in the middle of a procedure and they feel compelled to answer the mobile phone and start talking to someone and distracting themselves. That's it from me. I'll open the floor up to people who've got any questions, so you can stick your hand up using the controls or start typing away like crazy on the Q&A panel. Yeah, looking at one of the comments there, I presume it's Scott, having previously stood in front of a glider holding the nose up for assisting the wheel brake and preventing the tail lifting up. So yes, there's been a fair number of horror stories that have been relayed to me in the last couple of weeks involving aircraft that have been doing engine runs without the wings on, including aircraft that have rolled over in the fuselage cradle, causing propeller strikes, aircraft that have lifted their tail up because there's not a lot of mass behind the centre of gravity, and the propeller has had enough thrust to lift the tail up and start tipping the aircraft over, or the aircraft has started rolling forwards. We will be looking very closely at the advice on doing engine runs with the wings without having the wings fitted and the tail fitted, so de-rigged aircraft. Many of the aircraft maintenance manuals, and even the flight manuals, specifically cancel or prohibit the running of the engines without, or the operation of the engine without having the aircraft fully rigged. Being behind the aircraft is the safest place. Paul, you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was just starting to type as well. Jet engines kind of worry me a little bit, just because if a disc lets go, your safety zone is pretty big, or blades come off.
The good news is they're going to be projecting out to the sides. A propeller being shed from the aeroplane, even just a blade, will go flying off out to the side at quite a high velocity. Once it bounces off something, who knows where it's going to end up? You've got a fairly wide probability. But the same with the jets, having a turbine or a compressor let go, will project out to the side, and then once it's bounced, who knows where it's ending up. The difficulty there with doing engine runs and things like that is you're more likely going to want to have a strap over the tail boom and staked to the ground quite securely, because you don't want to have someone sitting in the jet blast holding the tail down or something equally unfortunate.
Yeah, you just certainly don't want anyone out to the side for,
yes.
About 500 meters probably.
This is going to be quite a little review of our operating procedures and our maintenance procedures, and some of the advice on where people should be standing. If you look at airliners, they've got a big red line up the side of the fuselage where either the prop blades sit or the turbines sit. And there's a pretty good reason why that line there, that is the danger line, where if something parts company, that's where it's going to puncture the fuselage.
Yeah.
There's plenty of photos on the internet of blades that have punctured fuselages, and it's bang on that red line, or discs that have let go and it's bang on that red line.
Yeah. No, that was my only comment, but no, good. Lots of learnings from this. Good.
Yes, that's the idea of it. Thanks, Paul.
There's a couple of questions in the system about the removal of the M10 bolt in the first place.
Get on that.
And the language issue in the manuals.
Okay. To answer the first question, the maintenance manual specifically states to remove the M10 bolt and then try to pull the pulley off that stub axle. Now that's got an interference fit between the bearings on that pulley and that stub axle. The maintenance manual then goes on to say that if you can't pull the pulley off, to then undo the 4 M8s and pull the that stub axle, let's call it what the maintenance manual calls the hub, off the pylon. And it then says to use a plastic mallet to tap the pulley off that stub axle. The idea being you then send the prop with the pulley attached to it off the maintenance manual, and the stub axle gets put back on the aeroplane. And then when you get to reinstall the prop, all you need to do is put the pulley back onto the stub axle, and that M10 bolt goes straight back through the middle. It was the confusion between the use of the word hub in the maintenance manual and the use of the word hub by the propeller manufacturer. The propeller manufacturer was saying, we want the hub and the pulley sent together. They didn't want the propeller blades and the folding mechanism removed from the pulley. However, the aircraft maintenance manual was using the word hub in reference to that stub axle, that spindle that everything spins on. And so it wasn't removed from the assembly because the people pulling it apart said, oh no, the manufacturer has specifically said they want the hub attached. So that was possibly a poor translation from the German into the English. And
compounded by the drawing issue, which shows the bolt in the side elevation, but not the bolt head in the plan.
Yes, there's a couple of little drawing errors there. So again, we've sent a copy of the report off to the aircraft manufacturer, and we've highlighted the issue with the maintenance manual. We have not yet had a response from the aircraft manufacturer either in relation to the maintenance manual. One of the recommendations, and it's only a suggestion really, is for manufacturers to consider putting critical item checks at the end of their installation procedures. One of the lessons learnt in defence was after the Sea King crash at Neas Island during the Boxing Day tsunami recovery efforts.
Split pins.
And split pins. A split pin got left out of the pitch control mechanism. One of the lessons they learnt was the maintenance manuals really needed to have a checklist at the end of the maintenance procedure that listed the critical items that needed to be checked. So in this case, you would needed to have looked at the M10 mounting bolt was correctly installed and torqued up, that the 4 and 8 mounting bolts were for the stub axle were correctly torqued and done up, and presumably, off the top of my head, the belt tension was set appropriately. So that suggestion, which is in the report, has been made to the manufacturer. I will have a chat with some of the OSTIV people later about whether or not we can utilise some leverage from OSTIV to encourage the manufacturers to lift their game a bit with the standards of their maintenance manuals in the detail, and potentially including these critical item checks for important maintenance procedures which have pretty dire outcomes if they go wrong. However, sailplanes being the aircraft they are, they tend to have very little redundancy, so just about most of the major maintenance procedures have some pretty dire outcomes if they go astray. Paul, you've still got your hand up, but Chris, you've got to have a question. Chris, you might need to unmute yourself.
Unmute. Is that better? That better?
Yes, that's better. We've got you now.
Yeah. Did the maintenance manual for this particular aircraft have exploded views of the components? And quite often you see that they'll be figurized, like figure 1 is, M10 bolt, figure 2 is pulley.
It sort of has that. It has a two view, a view facing from the rear and a view facing from the side, and it has a number of text boxes with arrows pointing at key components.
Okay, but it doesn't actually, say figure 1 propeller, figure 2 hub. No, okay.
It does list the M10 bolt in the text of the installation of the removal procedure, and
Yeah.
the installation procedure is literally the reverse of the removal procedure. One of the things we noted was that the rear view, the plan view of the installation diagram, doesn't actually show the head of the bolt. It's got an open hole there.
Yeah.
The head of the bolt is shown in the side view though, so it's been omitted in the drawing.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. And most machinery you work on, they show like putting a spindle back together for a machine or whatever, shows a detailed diagram of exactly what the part is. It might be part A, but part A could be a bearing or whatever, and it explains how it goes together. That would possibly be advantageous in this situation too. One
of the criticisms has been gliders have evolved from what were very simple aeroplanes, very simple control systems, very simple structures, and with the advent of self-launching or sustainer aircraft with pop-up engines and things, they've gotten very complicated very quickly. But the standard of the maintenance manuals hasn't necessarily caught up, and it can be best described as somewhat basic.
Yeah.
And I think there does need to be a bit of effort invested by the manufacturers in improving the standards there.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. And take your hand down when you're ready.
Okay.
Anybody else?
It's a question from Murray in the system, in the Q&A.
Okay, so it's not it's not scrolling up when I as these questions come in. What sanctions are there? Costs, fines, liability for people doing maintenance without approved training or achieving a certificate? Obviously, the risks to their own safety they seem to accept readily, but what if others fly their aircraft? Very difficult. The only thing that I can do from the airworthiness point of view is suspend the CFA, strictly speaking, and that then means to get the CFA unsuspended. The aircraft needs to get the once over by an approved person with the right credentials to double check everything that's been done to the aeroplane. In severe cases, it might be warranted to even cancel the CFA. That is possibly the single worst thing that I could do to anybody as CAD, because it takes a phenomenal amount of work to regain the CFA once it's been cancelled. It is really the thermonuclear weapon of the airworthiness world. So in this case, it's had a Form 2 since these people have played with it. The Form 2 can go through and double check what they've done and make sure that it hasn't compromised the safety of the aircraft. There is a background investigation trickling along to look at how this aircraft got into the state that it was in. The previous owner did have approvals, but was pretty clearly doing the wrong thing, I think, in some instances. So need to have a look at what's going on in the history of this aeroplane, and if warranted, we may need to suspend the CFA until we resolve that. We'll see what comes out. Drew's got his hand up.
Yeah, just following on from that, there's been some lively discussion about what the scope of the report should be, and the sanctions and remedies issue always bobs up in the background, and we've been at pains to try and segregate the safety investigation, the investigation of causes and contributing factors, from any issues about consequence or sanctions. That's a separate set of decisions that might be taken by airworthiness qualified people. But we're here in this safety space trying to get the understanding of the incident so that we can put in place the best remedies and preventions in future. Now, there is some work going into remediation planning and get well plans to assure the integrity of the maintenance work being conducted. But as is self-evident from this, there's a missing bolt, and there's 100 ways that we can get missing bolts in routine maintenance on our aircraft, regardless of whether people are approved or not. We've been asking the question about what is needed across the gliding movement to raise awareness of these particular kinds of problems and how they can bite us. So we're looking at constructive paths, carrots, as well as sticks. I'll shut up now.
No, that's okay, it's fine. I will point out that this particular investigation was deliberately set up, bookmarked by the event at one end and the point at which the bolt was removed at the other end at the beginning. Otherwise, we would have started off with the aircraft being manufactured and investigating a whole lot of other rabbit holes that have befallen this aircraft along the way. So this is purely and simply from the point that the bolt was removed to the point where the propeller departed the aeroplane. And the lessons that we can learn from it, and what we need to do to try and improve things going into the future. And there's quite a bit of work to be done by the Airworthiness Department as a result of that. Rob, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much. In my industry, the manufacturers limit the amount of information they give you or supply you spare parts without software to force you to go through approved service procedures. Is this happening in gliding?
Not at the moment, to my awareness. In fact, to a certain degree, you can see some of the opposite happening. One of the challenges I have at the moment is we're getting a lot of, quite a number of electric sustainer or electric self-launch sailplanes arriving in the country very shortly. We have very, very, very few people in the country qualified to actually work on these sailplanes as approved maintainers. And the people who are currently qualified have all forked out their own money to go overseas to get training, almost. There's a couple that haven't. So I'm very busily at the moment trying to get a set of training syllabi sorted out for electric self-launch or an electric sustainer, because there's a completely different risk profile with these aeroplanes. However, you get some of the manufacturers now saying that they have, and advertising this fact, that they have made it so, these electric aeroplanes so simple that anybody can work on them providing they've got a current motor rating. I beg to disagree. They're trying to open up the market and encourage people to go and buy their product by saying it's so easy, anybody can do it. I think anyone in playing with high voltage battery systems and things really should have a specific rating for that kind of thing. So they're working against having necessarily particularly trained and qualified people with specific knowledge working on these things in a way, in that sense. So yeah, it's not happening in gliding at the moment, and I think gliding may go that way in the future, but I think it might take a few nasty events for it to go that way. That's the answer to the question. I think you're back on mute again.
Yes, that answers the question. Yeah, it happens here.
Not a problem. Anybody else? Yes. looking at chat, it would be helpful if GFA circulated a broad reminder period to all members about rights and responsibilities in regards to maintenance. One of the things we found relatively recently was people who were purchasing sailplanes for the first time and becoming a registered operator were not familiar with the requirements of being a registered operator. So one of the things the GFA office is doing now with every transfer of registration, the new RO is getting the link to the RO handbook, and that's quite a detailed little manual about their requirements of what they're supposed to be doing, and they're actually legally liable for quite a lot of bits and pieces, including ensuring that the people doing work on their aircraft are appropriately qualified. So yes, one of the outcomes of this will need to go and circulate that information more broadly.
There's another question about a copy of these slides, mate.
Yes, look, I'm recording this. It will be going up on the GFA YouTube channel. I can provide a copy of the slides, and I'll probably go and locate it somewhere with the next to the report somewhere. I'll work out a suitable web location for it.
I've got a general question for everyone, and that is, how useful is this sort of discussion?
While people are formulating their reply to that, there's one more on the Q&A. Shouldn't EASA Form 1 include a boldface checklist for the reinstallation of the overhaul components? Maybe, strictly speaking, I would rather see that checklist going into the maintenance manual, which is pretty much what we were discussing earlier. The EASA Form 1 is really to certify that the work that was done has been done appropriately and been signed off appropriately, etc., etc., etc. I think the manufacturer is going to draw the line at the reinstallation by somebody else. But we need to have that discussion with the propeller manufacturer about that. They've signed up for the work that they've done, but along the way they haven't, maybe they missed that the bolt was not there, or they've ignored that the bolt wasn't there. Okay, any more from anybody else? Roger Druce has got his hand up. Just be a minute. Roger, you need to unmute yourself.
Can you read me now?
Yep, gotcha.
Then we're all carrying out maintenance in our little old workshops, and from time to time we have untoward things happen which reach the stage of being SOAR reports. I mean, they've got big significance. But, you know, we also need to have happen is that when people have little bits of learning with the particular gliders they're working on, that they, you know, record that information against that type and so accumulate their experience in a meaningful way. And that needs to be done at an individual or club level. It's not just a matter of completing the maintenance and saying, well, we got it right, we overcame these problems. There's many times when you need to record what you've learned, because 3 years, 4 years down the track, there might be the same thing happens, and or the glider passes over to another different club member to perform the Form 2 inspection, and they don't have the benefit of learning. So at a club level, there's considerable value in recording information about what you've learned each annual inspection. Yeah. I mean, nationally, we try to put this together in our airworthiness advice notices on the particular sailplane type, and that's a great thing. But there's such a hell of a lot of work to do it at a national level. It's not so easy, but it can be done productively at a club level or at your own individual glider level. I mean, I've got a stack of stuff on the Arcus, which of that nature. It's invaluable. That's not for me.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I was going to point out that the airworthiness team is trying to reinvigorate the AN system such that as lessons learned and defects are reported, we've been updating the ANs as appropriately. In severe cases, if it's not AD worthy, we would put out an airworthiness alert to the ROs of particular types of sailplanes if we find out there's some lessons learned. And over time, those airworthiness alerts will be cancelled and rolled into the AN system. So the AN system is there to help pass these lessons on to people as we move into the future, and people should be using the defect reporting system a bit more frequently, or even just sending an email to Dennis saying, hey, here's a gotcha that we learned on type X. And it's worthy of including in the lessons learned part of the ANs. And I'll disagree with Roger very slightly. It's not a pain in the neck to keep up to date with at a national level. We do have Dennis as a paid employee, whose part of his job is to deal with these situations. It is potentially, with 128 plus types around the place, but very easy for the Australia to overwhelm the airworthiness system if they decide to put in defect reports all at once, but we'll chug through it and get it done. That's what part of the role of the airworthiness system is, to collate and promulgate this information of lessons learned. Anyway, thanks, Roger. Anybody else? Another one there from James. These questions are excellent. Yep, cool. All right, if there's nothing else for anybody else, we'll call it a night. Thank you everyone for turning up. Thank you, Drew, for helping out.